In the early 16th century, entire civilizations in the Americas stood at their height, vast cities rising from lakes and mountains, intricate trade networks stretching across continents, temples filled with ritual and political power. Within a single generation, many of those societies would lose a majority of their people. Not to armies alone, not to superior weapons or strategy, but to an unseen biological force carried across the Atlantic. In 1520, smallpox entered the Americas. The consequences would reshape two continents and alter the balance of world history. Before Europeans arrived, the Western Hemisphere had been isolated from Afro-Eurasia for thousands of years. In that time, indigenous societies developed an ecological and cultural independence. Major states such as the Mexico-dominated Aztec Empire in central Mexico and the Inca Empire in the Andes governed millions. Urban centers like Tenochtitlan, built on an island in Lake Texcoco, rivaled the largest cities in Europe in population and organization. Agricultural systems were sophisticated, social hierarchies deeply rooted, and political alliances carefully maintained. What these societies did not share, however, were the epidemic diseases that had circulated for centuries in Europe, Asia, and Africa. Smallpox, caused by the variola virus, had long been endemic in parts of the Old World. Repeated outbreaks over generations had produced partial immunity among survivors. Though devastating in Europe, smallpox typically affected populations that had prior exposure. In the Americas, no such immunity existed. The first sustained contact between Europeans and the Caribbean began in 1492 with the voyages of Christopher Columbus. Over the following decades, Spanish settlements took hold on islands such as Hispaniola and Cuba. There, indigenous Taino communities experienced catastrophic population decline due to forced labor, violence, and disease. While the exact timing of the earliest smallpox cases in the Caribbean remains debated, by 1518 a severe outbreak was recorded on Hispaniola. Spanish chroniclers noted the rapid spread and high mortality among indigenous communities who had never encountered the disease. In 1519, Hernán Cortés landed on the Gulf Coast of Mexico and began his march inland toward the heart of the Aztec Empire. His expedition was small, numbering only a few hundred soldiers, but it forged alliances with indigenous groups hostile to Aztec rule. As tensions escalated, conflict erupted in Tenochtitlan in 1520. That same year, a Spanish ship arriving from the Caribbean is believed to have carried an infected individual. Smallpox soon appeared in the city. Primary sources from indigenous and Spanish accounts describe the epidemic's sudden onset. The disease spread quickly through densely populated urban centers. Without prior exposure, mortality rates were extraordinarily high. Modern historians estimate that in some regions, between one-third and one-half of the population may have died in a single outbreak. Among the victims was Cuitlahuac, the Aztec ruler who had succeeded Moctezuma II after his death during the conflict with the Spanish. His death from smallpox in late 1520 disrupted political continuity at a critical moment. When Cortés and his allied forces returned to besiege Tenochtitlan in 1521, the city was already weakened. Smallpox had reduced the fighting force, undermined leadership, and strained food supplies. Although the Spanish relied heavily on tens of thousands of indigenous allies, the epidemic contributed significantly to the collapse of organized resistance. In August 1521, Tenochtitlan fell. The Aztec Empire was dismantled, and Spanish colonial rule began in central Mexico. The impact of smallpox did not end with a single campaign. Waves of epidemic disease followed European expansion across the Americas. In central Mexico, demographic studies suggest that the indigenous population, estimated at perhaps 20 million or more in 1519, fell to a fraction of that number within a century. While smallpox was one of several introduced diseases, including measles, influenza, and typhus, it played a central role in the earliest and most devastating outbreaks. Further south, the Inca Empire faced a similar fate. In the 1520s, smallpox moved along trade and communication routes that connected northern South America to the Andean highlands. The disease likely preceded direct Spanish contact. Around 1525, the Inca Emperor Huayna Capac died, possibly from smallpox, along with his designated heir. The sudden loss of leadership triggered a civil war between his sons Atahualpa and Huáscar. By the time Francisco Pizarro and his expedition arrived in the Andes in the early 1530s, the Inca state was fractured by internal conflict. Atahualpa emerged victorious in the civil war but ruled over a divided empire. In 1532, Pizarro captured Atahualpa at Cajamarca in a surprise attack. Though the Spanish force was small, the political instability and demographic losses caused by epidemic disease had already weakened the empire's cohesion. Within a few years, Spanish control expanded across much of the Andean region. Across North America, smallpox spread along indigenous trade networks long before sustained European settlement reached certain areas. Archaeological and documentary evidence suggests that epidemics in the 16th and 17th centuries traveled ahead of direct contact. In the southeast, the collapse of complex Mississippian chiefdoms may have been accelerated by disease introduced indirectly through coastal exchanges. In the northeast, outbreaks were recorded among Wampanoag and other communities in the early 17th century, just before the arrival of English settlers at Plymouth in 1620. These epidemics reshaped the demographic landscape. In many regions, population declines were severe enough to alter land use, settlement patterns, and political structures. European colonists often encountered territories that appeared sparsely populated, unaware that thriving societies had existed only years earlier. This misperception influenced colonial policies and justifications for expansion. The demographic collapse also had profound economic consequences. Spanish colonial systems such as the encomienda relied on indigenous labor for agriculture and mining. As populations fell, labor shortages intensified. To compensate, the Spanish crown increasingly turned to the transatlantic slave trade, bringing enslaved Africans to work in the Americas. Thus, epidemic disease contributed indirectly to the expansion of African slavery in the New World. Social structures within indigenous communities were deeply affected. The loss of elders disrupted the transmission of cultural knowledge, oral traditions, and spiritual practices. Political hierarchies destabilized as leaders died without clear successors. In some cases, survivors consolidated into new communities for mutual support. In others, fragmentation led to migration and realignment of alliances. Religious interpretations of the epidemics varied. Some indigenous communities understood the disease within their own cosmological frameworks, while others saw in it a sign of spiritual imbalance or divine displeasure. Spanish missionaries sometimes interpreted outbreaks as evidence of providential favor for Christian conquest. Such interpretations influenced the pace and methods of conversion efforts throughout the colonial period. It is important to note that the spread of smallpox was not a single event but a recurring pattern. Major epidemics occurred in cycles, often every generation, as new cohorts of children were born without immunity. In 1633 to 1634, a severe outbreak struck indigenous communities in New England. In the 18th century, smallpox continued to affect both indigenous and European-descended populations, though prior exposure reduced mortality among colonists. Efforts to control the disease gradually emerged. In the late 18th century, inoculation practices, known as variolation, were introduced in parts of the Americas. After Edward Jenner's development of vaccination in 1796, campaigns to distribute the smallpox vaccine expanded. Notably, the Spanish crown organized the Balmas expedition in 1803 to carry the vaccine to its colonies, including territories in the Americas. While these measures came centuries after the initial epidemics, they marked a shift in public health approaches. The long-term demographic impact of smallpox and other introduced diseases is still studied by historians and epidemiologists. Estimates vary, but many scholars conclude that indigenous populations in the Americas declined by tens of millions during the first century after contact. Disease was not the sole cause; warfare, forced labor, displacement, and famine also contributed. However, epidemic disease was a primary driver of the scale and speed of population loss. The consequences extended beyond the Americas. The collapse of major indigenous empires facilitated European imperial expansion. Silver extracted from mines such as Potosi in present-day Bolivia flowed into global trade networks, linking the Americas to Europe and Asia. Agricultural products, including maize and potatoes, moved in the opposite direction, transforming diets worldwide. These exchanges formed part of what historians call the Columbian Exchange, a vast transfer of organisms, goods, and people between hemispheres. Yet the Columbian Exchange was profoundly asymmetrical in its biological effects. While American crops thrived in Europe, Old World pathogens proved devastating in the Americas. The absence of prior exposure created what scholars describe as a virgin soil epidemic environment, where mortality rates could far exceed those in endemic regions. The memory of these epidemics remains embedded in indigenous histories and oral traditions. Modern research combines documentary records, archaeology, and genetic analysis to reconstruct patterns of disease spread and demographic change. While exact figures are debated, there is broad consensus that smallpox played a central role in the transformation of the Americas after 1492. In the centuries that followed, indigenous communities demonstrated resilience and adaptation. Despite catastrophic losses, they preserved languages, traditions, and identities. New political movements emerged in the colonial and post-colonial eras, asserting rights and sovereignty. The story of smallpox in the Americas is therefore not only one of devastation but also of survival. By the 20th century, coordinated global vaccination campaigns reduced smallpox incidence worldwide. In 1980, the World Health Organization declared smallpox eradicated, the first human disease to be eliminated through deliberate public health effort. Its eradication closed a chapter that had shaped human history for millennia. The events set in motion in 1520 cannot be understood solely as a medical episode. They were part of a broader process of contact, conquest, and exchange that connected continents in unprecedented ways. Smallpox altered military outcomes, destabilized empires, reshaped economies, and transformed demographic realities. It exposed the vulnerability of populations isolated from long-circulating pathogens and underscored the profound consequences of global integration. When smallpox reached the Americas, it did not act alone. It moved along the pathways of exploration, trade, and empire. Its impact was magnified by social structures, political conflicts, and ecological conditions. Within a few decades, societies that had flourished for centuries were irrevocably changed. The rise and fall of empires are often attributed to strategy, leadership, and technology. In the 16th century Americas, biology was equally decisive. The arrival of smallpox in 1520 marked a turning point in world history, one in which invisible microbes influenced the fate of millions and redrew the map of continents. The legacy of that moment endures in the demographic patterns, cultural landscapes, and historical memory of the modern Americas.